I'm going to wait till a couple more people come on in, man. You dig what I'm talking about? It's a double blast for the day. You dig what I'm talking about from your boy Cosmon. We're going to get into the hidden truths. White slavery in America. Uh-oh. We'll be right back, y'all. All right, it's your hostess with the most. It's burning like toast. Is Cosmon right back at this thing. You dig what I'm talking about? We ain't gonna let them breathe a second. You dig what I'm saying? We just gonna get right into this. You dig what I'm talking about? This is Jehovah Chronicles number 109. Hidden truths. Slavery in America. You know, they won't believe me. They wouldn't believe me. They couldn't believe me. You dig what I'm talking about? It goes against their cognitive dissonance. You dig what I'm talking about in their talking points and narratives. So we just gonna hear it out the white folks' mouth they sell. And if you thought you was ever gonna get a second, a dribble of reparations for slavery, well, then you don't know the story. Check it out.
People are ordering it through bookstores, and there's a growing audience for it. We've sold several thousand copies, and I think that the more publicity that it gets, eventually the audience will grow nationwide and worldwide, God willing.
Well, let's start talking about it. I got some questions to ask you. Now, we've been told that black people have been enslaved and oppressed in America for 400 years, and that the American people need to make reparations to blacks. Perhaps sometimes it's suggested cash payments. And as a result, they're saying of this black enslavement, that's the least we can do. Now, you've written a book claiming that it was the white people who were actually the first slaves in America. So who owes who, Mr. Hoffman?
Well, white people don't owe anyone, Pastor Peters. The fact of the matter is that white youth today are taught that black slaves and
now listen, he said that white people don't owe nobody. That's a lie too. I ain't gonna say it's a lie, it's an overstatement. What he was trying to say, or what he should say, is that the whole slavery thing, we don't owe them for. Watch this. I'm gonna just let this run. You dig what I'm talking about?
Mexicans and Chinese built this country, while the vast majority of the whites lorded it over them with a whiplash in one hand, and a mint julep in the other. But the documentary record tells a very different story. Up to one half of all the arrivals in the American colonies were white slaves, and they were America's first slaves. These whites were slaves for life, long before blacks ever were. And this white slavery was even hereditary. White children were born to white slaves, and they were also enslaved. Whites were auctioned on a block with children sold and separated from their parents. Wives were sold and separated from their husbands. Meanwhile, you had free black property owners walking the streets of northern and southern American cities, while white slaves are being worked to death in the sugar mills of Barbados and Jamaica, in the West Indies, and in the tobacco.
But wait a minute, ain't that the story they told you about you? Don't this story sound familiar? Ain't this the same story they say is happening to you at the same time? You gonna figure out, you're gonna find out that they lied about everything, including slavery. Who was really the slave? You heard the man say over half of all slaves brought into America were what you would call today white men. Did you hear that? And he said it was America's first slave. But I thought those were the Africans. We're going to find out some parts of the story were left the same, except they told you who was who in reverse. Let's go.
Plantations of Virginia. So the establishment has created this misnomer of indentured servitude to explain away and minimize the fact of white slavery. But if you really read even the establishment historians, if you read their footnotes, even they have to concede, at the very least in the 17th century, that black slavery was almost non-existent, and that whites were the overwhelming majority of slaves in America in the 17th century.
Did you hear that? In the 1600s, the 17th century, the overwhelming amount of slaves in America, the white folks, that ain't the story they tell us in school, is it? This ain't that whole 1619 doctrine they trying to tell you about, but they don't never tell you about what happened in 1618. Let's go.
Where does the word slave itself come from? Isn't it exclusively in reference to the experience of black people in bondage?
No, it isn't, Pastor Peters. Actually, the word slave derives from the white nation of people known as the Slavs, or the Slavic people. And they were enslaved longer than the entire history of the United States. The Slavic people were slaves about twice as long as blacks were slaves in North America. So the actual definition...
Did you hear that? The word slave come from the Slavic people. We know who the Slavic people are. Them ain't no black copper-toned negroidal Bantu nigger types. We know that. So the whole entire ideal of what a slave is comes from the Slav people. Let's let it sink in a second. Somebody told you a lie.
The definition of that word pertains to the experience of white people in bondage, yet the politically correct historians tell us that we're not allowed to refer to whites as slaves. So it's really a huckster's game that's at work there.
It's that old wordsmith game, isn't it?
That's correct.
How did the enslavement of whites in America begin anyway?
Well, the enslavement of whites in America really actually has its roots in Great Britain, because it's really a very complex story. Of course, the history of whites in bondage goes all the way back to the ancient world. The ancient Greeks and the ancient Romans, of course, held slaves, and the majority of those slaves were white. This has pretty much been the essential experience of all people throughout time, and it's ludicrous to say that it's exclusively the experience of blacks. However, if we bring this up to the American colonial period, we must go to Britain, because, of course, America was a colony of Britain. And Britain began its decline in the 16th century, shortly after the reign of Henry VIII. It really, I would say, it went into decline under his son, the very...
Was it say planters who, hold on one second. Planters who want to make a fortune in the West Indies must procure white slave labor out of ooh-wee, 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 white slave labor out of England, not Africa. Uh-oh. Or did they go to Africa too? Did they find a whole nother stock of white people? Remember, they told you these Africans got off the boat. Who are the Africans? We're going to get into that too, but we're going to let the story go on unfold. We're going to let them tell you their story themselves.
Very weak boy king, Edward VI. And in the era of Edward VI, we see that usury, or the charging of interest on loans, that had been illegal in Britain. And during the reign of Edward VI, he was being manipulated by his counselors, and that's when usury was legalized in Britain in 1548. And from that point onward, you also had the beginnings of the enclosure laws, which was the taking away of the right of the English people to farm freely in these common lands which had existed. They were basically swindled out of their land. And from that, you had a pauperization process beginning. You had the first real beginnings of a class of white people in Great Britain known as paupers. And once you had that, of course, you had all the social evils that came along with the paupers. Now, pauperization began in a large-scale way under Queen Elizabeth I, and this is when you had the first welfare laws in Britain being passed. And when white people who had formerly been yeomen, who had been freemen, now there had been a class of white slaves in early Britain known as the villains, from which we get the disparaging term of villain. It was spelled a little bit differently with an E on the end instead of an A. However, you still had a majority of the whites able to farm and able to live as free men. Now, more and more, the majority of whites were changing over from free men and yeomen and landholders and farmers over to this class, this formal...
Fair use, number 107, fair use. For teaching purposes only.
Class of paupers, and that's what began the roots of white slavery, because once you had paupers, you had developing the workhouse system, which was the way to manage the paupers, which was to enslave them in an institution where they could be controlled, which was the workhouse system in Great Britain.
That's an amazing story. In fact, it's so amazing that I know there are some people just using the understanding cognitive dissonance, that they're rejecting some of the things you're saying because it seems so fantastic that they've never heard this. What happened to whites in Great Britain if they opposed the king or they were defeated in battle? You know, in high school today and colleges, we're told that the whites have been so-called indentured servants. That we do hear about some of indentured servants in America, but never slaves. And I know you addressed the book, and I want you to tell the people about it.
Try to lessen indenturement,
right. Well,
like it is something special or different. No, you was a slave
people
too.
Who were opposing the king, or if they lost in battle in the various civil wars and rebellions in Great Britain, generally one of their punishments, if they were fortunate enough to escape execution, was enslavement. And what would happen to them is they would be transported. That was a technical term. It didn't just mean that you were put on a ship, but it was actually a term related to forced deportation from Great Britain. And these various white rebels against the crown were then transported to the British Crown colonies of the West Indies, particularly Barbados and Jamaica, where they were basically worked to death in the sugar mills there. And when white tourists go to Jamaica and Barbados, they're basically going to the scene of a white Holocaust, because most of these white men didn't survive beyond the first couple of years there. However, this enslavement was long-term. It just did not involve only political prisoners or those who had lost battles, but it also involved the kidnapping, as I will discuss later, of whites off the streets of Great Britain, so that even in the early parts of the 20th century, you had a remnant.
Did y'all see that? Where the term kidnapping come from? Kidnapped, nabbed. See how the language changed? Napped. Kidnapped. Nab mean to grab up. Encouragement to the spiriting away of Englishmen without their consent and selling them for slaves, which hath been a practice very frequent and known by the name of kidnapping. From the calendar of the state papers, 1701.
Only political prisoners or those who had lost battles, but it also involved the kidnapping, as I will discuss later, of whites off the streets of Great Britain, so that even in the early...
So remember them stories about all them them breeding places and all that stuff? It wasn't your grandmama there. We're not saying it didn't happen. I'm saying who it happened to. You might got a little European in your family, but it didn't come from some European enslaving you and raping your ancestor. That didn't happen. As we finding out today, it's more likely that it happened to your European ancestor. And then there's even a deeper story beyond this that they never take into account. But we're going to go into it more because we got to learn who these Africans are getting off this boat. Remember, that's our story, right? That's the story we've been told. I'm going to tell you there were Africans getting off that boat. But just like we've been showing right here, who the slave was in actuality has been twisted around. Dig this.
Parts of the 20th century, you had a remnant of poor whites in Barbados known as the Redshanks, who were the survivors of white slavery there. So it was a very onerous thing to be captured in battle, and you were, in fact, subject to slavery as a result.
The Redshanks, would that any way tie up with the word rednecks?
Absolutely, yes.
Is that right?
Yes, this is one of the racist terms which the media freely uses. We're often told that the most horrible word, I think this specter was summoned in the O.J. Simpson circus, that the most horrible word in the English language, one of his lawyers said, was the N-word.
They are frequently hurried in droves under the custody of several brutal drivers into the back country to be disposed of as servants. Historian Marcus Jernigan. You dig what I'm saying? Did y'all hear that? Where the word redneck comes from? Comes from the Barbadian slaves, white slaves, right? Who were called red shanks, meaning red legs, red necks, well, your body parts. You dig what I'm talking about? Like your arms, your legs, your neck. Wow, that's crazy. And it's a negative term that equates to what it would to be nigger to black folks. Redneck is to white folks. Dang.
However, to conscious white people, one of the most horrible words is the word redneck. And this term of derision is bandied about in movies and television and in the newspapers totally blithely. We're just supposed to take this. We're supposed to be labeled in this way. However, if we look at the etymology of the word, the root of it is...
Dang. I bet y'all never seen that. The black dude hanging the white guys. Who the slave? They told us this stuff all in reverse.
Is a means of poking fun at poor white people whose skin would redden in the sun in the West Indies, and they would be called hillbillies, Scotland Johnnies by blacks and by wealthy whites who enslaved them, red shanks, and eventually this term of derision, this loathsome, contemptible term for poor white people, eventually evolved into the modern day term of redneck. Yes.
Wow. Hillbilly, mountain Johnnies. That's crazy. Red shanks eventually evolved into red neck because the neck could be out there red in the mud in that sun down there in the islands. That's crazy. They do not teach this in school. This is crazy.
That's fascinating. How were the slaves actually enslaved? How were the whites enslaved if they were not just indentured servants?
Well, the indentured servant thing was basically a racket. I mean, there was a minority of people who were in bondage who were fortunate enough to have been indentured servants, because after all, indentured servitude, when it is practiced correctly and legally, is a form of apprenticeship. Someone, as we were told in high school and college, would trade a period of his labor in return for passage over on a boat or in return for instruction in a skilled trade. So that is a legitimate a contract there between a laborer and an employer.
And this is how they tricked our ancestors in. Right? But it's only after hundreds of years. This is how they tricked your ancestors in, with the promise of employment. Right? They couldn't have whooped you niggas. First of all, it ain't even enough of them here. And then later, through law and misappropriation of law and unscrupulous people, certain people were enslaved. Land was taken, usurped. Many of these people that they say owned so-called slaves were slaves themselves before. These quote-unquote white folks. They ain't told this story right yet. We're going to get to the bottom of it. Let's go.
And I certainly sanction it. I think it's a good thing. In fact, I'd like to see apprenticeship practiced more today as more and more young people get away from the public school systems and they're homeschooled by their parents. And then as they reach their teens, why, it would be quite natural for them to apprentice themselves to a manager or someone who had something to teach them. However, under this euphemism of indentured servitude, Pastor Peters, a tremendous hoax and a tremendous swindle was perpetrated against the poor white people. And that is to say, it functioned in two ways. One, as a cover-up for the actual experience of white people in slavery.
And that's one thing you ain't gonna never be able to say about the faithists, that we don't bring the truth to the light, because this is gonna help some white folks too. And I believe this is one of the reasons why they always try to tie you to Africa, that the beginnings come to Africa. You must come from Africa too, nigga. We finding out that's not true. But do white people come from Africa? If you told everything else in reverse, you told that lie too. Hold on, let's go.
In other words, as this slavery grew larger and larger, and the white aristocracy in Britain scrambled for a way to cover it up, they grouped it under the notion of a contract for indenture. Secondly, it functioned as a way of entrapping people. In other words, people would be press-ganged or kidnapped aboard ships, and a spurious indenture would be written out for them, allegedly corresponding to the biblical injunction that no servitude is to go beyond a period of 7 years, and this is where we get the notion of a 7-year limit. In fact, that limit was completely ignored, and these people were referred to as indentured servants. They were even told that they had a contract of indenture, but in fact they were slaves for life. Now, the way this occurred, the real engine of this enslavement in Britain was kidnapping. And again, if we go to our study of words, we find out that the origin of the word kidnapping, which is now a universal term for anyone who steals people, relates to white slavery. If you go to the old dictionaries, you'll find out that the original word was kidnabbing, Nabbing, and it's a specific reference to stealing white children and white adults for servitude in colonial America. And tens of thousands of them were kidnapped from the port cities of England and Scotland. In fact, it got so bad in the late 17th century that parents were in great fear to let their children go to the port cities on an errand without their parents or some other adult guardian safeguarding them. And in fact, even if an adult was along, oftentimes that adult would be knocked on the head and put on board the ship. And in my book, They Were White and They Were Slaves, I give many accounts of this mass kidnapping in action. So that was the principal means by which whites were brought to America as slaves. A secondary means was to trick them into the idea that they were going to have a limited contract of indenture for 7 years.
We're going to get into a third means.
But then when they came to America, you see, there was a way to lengthen that 7 years and to violate the biblical injunction against servitude going beyond 7 years. The way that happened was to create a roster of petty offenses. For example, if a white slave was away.
Does that sound familiar? Does that sound familiar to you? These should sound just like black codes. Are you getting it now? They usurped, re-rocked, and repackaged an identity of another people and pushed it onto us. Y'all seeing it? By petty offense. Are these not black codes? Listen, this is why the 13th Amendment works. That if you can become a person who, quote unquote, breaks the law, you become a slave. You revert back to slave status. This is why it works. Let's rewind that back just a second. Let's go back to right here. Let's go right here. Check this out.
They were white and they were slaves. I give many accounts of this mass kidnapping in action. So that was the principal means by which whites were brought to America as slaves. A secondary means was to trick them into the idea that they were going to have a limited contract of indenture for 7 years. But
how much you want to bet the indenture worked way more and faster than the force? How much, you know, with the promise of you going to a new land, you're going to get this land when you get there. All you got to do is work these 7 years. Boy, and then we got to take in to the fact that England was dumping Germany, Denmark, Sweden. They was taking the prisoners of Ireland, Scotland. They was taking the dregs of society and forcing them into indentures also. So the dregs of society from Europe came over here first. Watch this. This get deep.
then when they came to America, you see, there was a way to lengthen that 7 years and to violate the biblical injunction against servitude going beyond 7 years. The way that happened was to create a roster of petty offenses. For example, if a white slave was away from his work or away from the plantation for more than a day, or even for more than an hour, if the overseer decided that this was an arbitrary absence, they would add on a month of servitude to the white slave's time of service. And through various stratagems and tricks, this adding on went to the point where the people ended up being enslaved for life. And that's the real reality of bondage of whites in America. It's white slavery and not largely indentured servitude.
It's an amazing story, and ladies and gentlemen, this amazing story is told in Mr. Hoffman's book, They Were White and They Were Slaves, The Untold History of the Enslavement of Whites in Early America. Truth of the matter is, whites were the first slaves in America, not blacks, and that the media is not telling you. We're carrying this book, and of course I'm offering it on this shortwave broadcast. And if you were there white children who were made slaves? How about white women also?
Yes, very definitely. If you were born to a white woman, then you also became the property of the owner. Now, for a white woman was basically banned. A white slave woman could not be married. And, of course, the slave masters realized that these women were going to exercise this function of nature, that it would be unnatural for them to suppress their procreative urge. And there were secret marriages, of course, by the score between white slave males and white slave females. But this played right into the hands of their owners, because then more time was added on to their allegedly limited service by the fact that she had these children out of wedlock. Then the children became the property of the master. Now, it depended on which era of colonial law this occurred in. The law became more liberal in the 18th century. In the early 18th century, a child born to a white woman who was enslaved would be the slave of the master if it was a female till she was 18, if it was a male until he was 21. However, in the 17th century, when things were much rougher, their enslavement could go as long as until the age of 31. So this was really dependent on the local situation in the various states. It dates back to an old Roman slave code which decreed partus sequitur ventrum. The condition of the child follows the condition of the mother. So you see, this was really a slave law, which we've seen all these heart-rendering Hollywood movies and on Ted Turner's TNT channel and so forth. But what they never tell us is this was first the experience of white people in bondage, and only later the experience of some black people in bondage.
Now, if you understand that this is exactly opposite of what you've been taught, throw me a 1 in the chat. Exactly opposite right? Because I got taught that we was the slave. Now we looking back into the records and we really see what's going on. Now, I know people are going to say, well, don't this stop you from getting your reparations and boom, 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 boom. First of all, it's not about no money. We trying to get the land. That's one. This shows right here that somebody had to own these people. Somebody was already here. You're not going to get it for enslavement. You're going to get it for POW. Being a prisoner of war, being under occupation in your own country. They sold you into a system that didn't work. They walked you into a house that was already on fire.
So yes, white families suffered tremendously under white slavery in colonial America. You bet.
You're not saying that there weren't black families later on that also suffered, are you?
No, of course not. I regard the enslavement of blacks as a terrible tragedy for black people, but a worse tragedy for whites, primarily because this country, the Civil War, I think, was partly fought because there were white men in the North who abhorred the idea of using Negro labor to build the country. Congressman David Wilmot was a great Northern congressman who sponsored the Wilmot Proviso.
Look, on the auction block. Look.
And that said that white men should be the ones who settle the West, because the issue of the South being kind of the white nationalists on the side of the white people, and the Northerners all being race mixers on the side of the blacks, is really not an accurate dichotomy there. It was far more complex than that. And one of the issues was whether or not the Southern holders of black slaves were going to be allowed to import thousands of blacks into California and Oregon. And a lot of white working men didn't want this to happen, including Congressman David Wilmot. And so basically their attitude towards black enslavement was that it was a curse on America because white men wanted to be separatists. They wanted a separate nation, an all-white nation, and they wanted to do the toil. Now, in fact, they had done the toil because...
Pay attention. They talking about certain of our ancestors getting caught up in the peonage game. Remind you that it had been running already in America since 1618. I'm telling you, the only reason your ancestors may have got caught up in the plantation game is because they owned it. They became enslaved to law and taxes, putting them in peonage to the land that they already own. This is the indenture game. This is peonage.
The founding toil of this nation, the great land clearing and swamp clearing, the felling of the trees, was largely done by white pioneers. So that work had been done.
No, don't let them trick you. It had been done by white slaves, right? And he just came short of telling you that he's just short of telling you that the major cause of the Civil War in America was not because they was fighting over, they were so worried about you and your black slavery. No, it's because you owned white slaves massively by the stocks. The people that they telling you was a slave was not you. He was just telling you, well, who owned them? Who was there? Remember, this is business. This is how they came at us with it. Look, we got some white boys over here. They work like a mug too. Got a couple Mountain Johnnies. That's crazy. Mountain Johnnies is crazy. I ain't never heard that one before. Dang. That's crazy. But what they telling us is going on, once we look back for ourselves, once we stop believing people who ain't even of the culture telling us what our culture and our heritage is. But when we go back and look ourselves, we find it's a whole different story. The story is in reverse. And who they telling you the people is in slavery and where they come from is exactly the opposite. The Negro of America is from America. Huh? Many of the so-called blacks are from Europe. And many of the so-called whites are from Africa. How did you get down there to the Caribbean? Enslaved. I thought they brought the people from the west coast of Africa. But see, Cosmon goes and gets the stuff that they don't got. This is from the book, right? Let me go up to the top, show y'all. This is from the book, Forgotten Cause of the Civil War. A new look at the slavery issue, right? By Lawrence R. Tinzer. You dig what I'm talking about? And he wrote about the forgotten cause of the Civil War. And we're going to go down here to page 23. All right. Let's go down here to page 23. White slaves. Can everybody see this? We rocking? All right, let's get into it. All right. Regardless of legal criteria established for being a white person, mind you, I'm gonna go on here and show y'all Dr. Jane Battalora telling you no white people existed before 1681. Remember, this is a social status, right? Regardless of the legal criteria established for being a white person, it is a fact that many white people remained enslaved under Partis rule. What is Partis rule? That is, which is born follows the womb. This is the whole idea of you are what your mother is, right? Also, Partis was a legal doctrine passed in the colonial Virginia in 1662 and other English crown colonies in the Americas, which defined the legal status of the children born there. The doctrine mandated that children of slave mothers would inherit the legal status of their mothers. So children who were born from a mother who was a slave, regardless of skin color, followed her status, right? So this shows you that white and black, right, has nothing to do with skin color. In fact, right? But in a white supremacist system, they took the social structure that was on the bottom and brought it to the top. Remember, they used thou shall be, those who were last shall be first, and all that. They use this in their ideology of manifest destiny, right, to bring forth the result that they see fit for themselves. This is why it was an outrage when they seen all them white folks enslaved in the South, right? A most telling observation, right, because we're going to get into some eyewitness accounts. And remember, this is about the untold or forgotten cause of the Civil War. What they tell us it was for? They said it was for to free the niggas, right? A most telling observation is that Mary Boykin Chestnut, a Southern aristocrat and wife of James Chestnut Jr., the U.S. Senator from South Carolina, an entry in her diary for March 1861, right? This is 2 years before Lincoln was impressed, was inspired to let the quote unquote Negroes free. Who is he actually letting free? Huh? And remember, Lincoln, he ain't want to do it. He was like, nah, man, I don't even want to piss off the South, man. I don't want to. Could I be making a wrong move, man? We could. I don't have really no dog in this fight. Right? I come from enslavement and indenture stock too, but I'm Aboriginal. I'm copper colored. Yeah, y'all better check Lincoln out. Lincoln described himself in his own autobiography, copper colored, black, coarse hair. Uh-oh. So who is the guy they showing us? This is the stuff we uncovering in these times, right? Now look what the wife of the U.S. Senator says. In 1861, she said, like the patriarchs of old, our men live all in one house with their wives and their concubines. And the mulattoes one sees in every family exactly resemble the white children. And every lady tells you who is the father of all the mulatto children in everybody's household. But those in her own, she seems to think drop out of the clouds or pretends to or pretends so to think. Uh-oh. Uh-oh. Particularly noteworthy is her choice of the word exactly. Imagine how it must have been for plantation mistresses to see day in and day out white slave children who look the same as their own white children. Let that sink in, y'all. Worth noting here is that when Ben Ames Williams edited Chestnut's diary for publication in 1905, he changed the word exactly to the word partially. From the wording of the original quotation, one may infer that it was quite common, listen, in the antebellum households, right? Let me scoot over, to have white children and white slave children who all looked like each other. Let that sink in a second, y'all. Because we're going to get into some eyewitness accounts of people during them eras saying, whoa, I didn't even know you could enslave white people. And then you're going to see quote unquote black folks who many were aboriginals, right? If you see a master, right, and he got a white slave with him, the so-called black is really an Indian. He's an American Indian. He's not African. There are African people there who are enslaved. Many of them are pale-skinned. This is the part they don't tell you about. Uh-oh. Uh-oh. We're going to set it on fire. We're going to set it on fire. We're going to blow it up just a little bit so everybody can see it. Other accounts of white slaves were published during or after the Civil War. Reverend John H. Augie lived in the South for 11 years and had both white and black congregations. He told of preaching to slaves, some with red hair and blue eyes. Preaching to slaves, some with red hair and blue eyes, a third of whom were just as white as he was. This is the part they ain't telling you. Dr. Alexander Milton Ross attended a slave auction in New Orleans where many other slaves were much whiter than the white people who were there. Uh-oh. Uh-oh. In Lexington, Kentucky, Reverend Calvin Fairbank described a woman who was going to be sold at a slave auction as one, and I quote, one of the most beautiful and exquisite young girls one could expect to find in freedom or slavery, being only 1/64th African. How you know? But she whiter than the whitest of the white and came out of white mama and daddy. That's the only way you get that white. You come from a long line of white folks. Where the African come from? We're going to show you where the African come from. But let's keep getting some of these eyewitness accounts. This is what they can't duck. The people put the stuff in there. It's written down. Right? After 164, how can you tell? After the Union had won the Battle of New Bern, North Carolina in 1862, Major General Burnside assigned Vincent Collier to be superintendent of the poor. Collier expressed disbelief at the complexions he saw. The light color of many of these refugees is a marked peculiarity of the colored people of newborn. So being colored has nothing to do with skin. Colored, white, black are social constructs. Look at the refugees. They had a peculiarity, yet they were colored. You see that? I have had men and women apply for work. Look, they're applying for work. This is how we got caught up in it. It was a trick. I had men and women apply for work who were so white. Saying what Cosmon's saying. It's people who actually don't believe or fear that this could have even happened to the white man. They want this to have happened to them because this is what they've been taught. And now the understanding of people who actually do research, go back and check the historical record itself, is proven that what we've been taught was wrong and purposely taught wrong. This is why many people who are pale skinned don't even understand that they have white supremacy. They don't get it. Oh, I came up in a tough life too. Yeah. We know. But it's not about that. It's about an unearned opportunity. And that's what restitution for our people gonna look like. Booyah. We gonna get right into the system already working. We just gonna make it work better. Yeah. We gonna get up out of here before the system falls. You dig what I'm talking about? But we gonna ingratiate it, get it working all the way right. And then bust up. Let you run it how you want it. Without black backs, though. Ain't that dope? Without busting a shot. Collier expressed disbelief at the complexions he saw. He said, I had men and women apply for work who were so white that I could not believe that they had a particle of Negro blood in their veins. Nigga, I can't believe it. It's unbelievable. I can't believe it. Listen, they don't. Right? Or what we commonly know as an African, huh? But we gonna see who the Africans is. Right? But we gonna get into a couple more of these eyewitnesses. Right? The memoirs of Chestnut, Augie, Ross, Fairbank, and Collier were published during or after the Civil War. Many of the accounts were published all through the period before the Civil War, in which travelers, this is before the Civil War, in which travelers and visitors to the South made note of the white slaves they saw on plantations and at slave auctions. Their expectations, of course, was to see slaves who were brown or black. So when they got there and they seen all these whites, they like, damn. On seeing white slaves for the first time, they often expressed surprise at how white those slaves really were. So much so that they wrote it in their diaries. Hundreds of years later, through technology and the rising of the spirit of the whole earth itself in this information era, we're able to go back, right? Piece this truth together. You dig what I'm talking about? Because we see somebody lying. When you check your history, right? When you go back and do your genealogy, if you have a slave in your family, they can readily be found. They were property and were taxed in many parts. For the most part, almost all the time. If you got people that came off a boat and were enslaved, they were written down. Not one of them was missed. So when you go back and do your history, if you don't find no slaves and people getting off boats, that's because they ain't there. Now you got to ask yourself, where did these people come from? They didn't come from anywhere. That's the whole African out of Africa black dichotomy, because it anybody can be black. Anybody can be white, per se. But when they got to them slave auctions and they seen all these slaves, they was like, damn, I thought these was white people. Well, who is all these niggas this here? I thought they was going to get sold. Oh, so what I've been told ain't what the reality is, and we seeing the same today. Look, they often express surprise at how white those slaves really were. All of the accounts which follow were readily available to the antebellum readers in the North. John Ferdinand Danzel Smith was an Englishman who visited America during the early 1870s, right? Let's keep that in mind. He came to the Americas in the 1870s. Now, they telling you in your history, it was you that was enslaved. Shouldn't be no white people here enslaved doing nothing. All right? But let's see the first-hand account, and this is why it's so important. People don't actually read. All right? This is why it's important. He was an Englishman who visited America during the early 1870s and had his memoirs published in 1784. Right? While in Maryland, he took notice of female slaves who are now become white by their mixture. How? If they were black, he got the whole idea that he's expecting black already too. So that means you can't a black dude get with a white dude or with a white girl and produce a mixed baby, and that baby mixed back with brown people and it become whiter. No, it got to mix back with more white folks, and that produce an even lighter white baby, and he get with a white folks. But if they supposed to be the slave stock, that means there's a whole bunch of slaves to produce from who are already white. You see now? So while in Maryland, he took notice of female slaves who are now become white by their mixture. They are, at this time, numbers of beautiful girls, many of them as fair as any living, who are absolutely slaves in every sense. Another 18th century traveler, 1700s, Jacques-Pierre Bristow de Warville, a Frenchman who came to the Americas in 1788. Look, while visiting a school for Negro children in Philadelphia, he saw an octoroon whom it was impossible to tell from a white boy. I'm going to tell you why. Because he wasn't a white boy. Yet, he was in a Negro school. So what Negro and white mean ain't got nothing to do with pale skin. You starting to see it now? See how they twisted the story up? Dr. Jesse Torrey mused on his interest first experience with white slavery. His book, published in 1817, contains the following account. While at a public house in Fredericktown, Maryland, there came a decently dressed white man. Listen, y'all, of quite a light complexion in company with one who was totally black. This 1817 in the north. This is Fredericktown, Maryland, in the north. There came a white dude walking with a black dude, right? Now, after they went away, the landlord observed that the white man was a slave. I asked him with some purpose how that could be possible, to which he replied that he was a descendant by female ancestry of an African slave. Listen. He also stated that not far from Fredericktown, there was a slave estate on which there were several white females of as fair and elegant appearance as white ladies in general, held in legal bondage as slaves. But look what he called them. He said their descent by female ancestry of an African slave. Now we must ask ourselves a question. Let's ask ourselves a question, right? Are there any white people in the world who call themselves African? I'm going to go far as to even go ahead and bust your cap open. The only people in the world who called themselves Africans are the Afrikaners. Huh? It's the only people in the world. Y'all starting to see how they twisted the story up? Watch this. Look where they at. They ain't tell you this part. Look, hold on. Watch this. Look where they at. The deepest. This is where they from. The deepest down here. But look at this. They ain't tell you about that. Angola and all that. They ain't tell you about that. That west coast of Africa. And look where they thick at. How you get here? When you get here? I bet you came here 16, 17, 1800s. Well into the 1900s, right through here. You came from Africa. Look, the only place that's deeper than South Africa is America. Look, on par with their home country. But they didn't tell you about this. And remember, these people up here in England and all them were dumping their criminals, you know what I mean, into Australia. Look where they at. Huh? Look where they thick at. On par with the Americans. Who really are the Africans? Let's look and see. Right? Let's look and see who the Africans really are. The Afrikaners, right? Who speak a language called Afrikaans, are a Southern African ethnic group descended from predominantly Dutch settlers. Huh? Wait a minute. That put a whole nother spin on the idea that black people from Africa was selling Africans. They was first start arriving in the Cape of Good Hope in the what? The 1600s. Until 1994, they dominated South Africa's politics as well as the commercial agriculture sector. Africans make up approximately 5.2 of the total South African population based on the number of white South Africans who speak Afrikaans as a first language in the South African National Census of 2011. The arrival of Portuguese explorer Vasco da Gama at Calicut, India in 1498 opened a gateway of free access to Asia from Western Europe around the Cape of Good Hope. However, it necessitated the founding and safeguarding of trade stations in the east, and Portuguese landed in Mossel Bay. Right? This is in South Africa in 1500. So the only people in the world, right, that we know of you know what I mean, called Afrikaan, are predominantly Dutch settlers. The free burghers, right, the burghers, were early European settlers at the Cape of Good Hope in the 18th century. But We just showed 1652. How much you want to bet? They've been there since 1500. Vasco da Gama went in 1498. They had to set up a post in South Africa. The introduction of free burghers to the Cape is regarded as the beginning of the permanent settlement of Europeans in South Africa. So that whole idea of being on the bottom of a boat took from Africa, you know, enslaved in the Caribbean and all that. It didn't happen to you. It didn't happen to us primarily. You dig what I'm talking about? I want to show this one too. This is from quote unquote African American pamphlet collection copy, African American pamphlet from the Library of Congress. You dig what I'm talking about? And this is by Anderson Boyles, January 6th, 1836. Right? Dig this. Look what it say. $100. Make sure everybody can see that. Okay. $100 reward will be given for the apprehension of my Negro. Let me just, okay. If y'all see that say Negro right there, $100 reward will be given for the apprehension of my Negro. If you can see that, hit me with a 2 in the chat. If you can see that, hit me with a 2 in the chat. $100 reward will be given for the apprehension of my Negro. Right? Him name is Edmund Kinney. Edmund Kinney is a Negro. Right? Let me prove to you that they told you the story in reverse. Right? Y'all see? You see that Edmund Kinney is a Negro, right? Let me show you something. Let me describe him to you. He has straight hair. This Negro has straight hair and a complexion so nearly white that it is believed a stranger would suppose there is no African blood in him. What do you mean, African? He's talking about the South African Dutch settlers, the only people in the world who are called Africans. There are no people in Nigeria who call themselves African. They are Igbo or Ifa or whatever they are. They're their tribal affiliations and names. They don't call themselves Africans. Even the quote-unquote Egyptians, they know they are Oromo people, or you dig what I'm talking about? Whatever tribal designation they affiliate with. They don't call themselves Africans. Nobody does except the predominantly Dutch settlers of Southern Africa, America, and Australia. You're starting to see it now? It wasn't you on the boat. It was the African on the boat. So, right? Dig this. Do this make more sense, right? Because this is the story they told you. They told you that white people came from Europe, right? White people came from Europe, and they came down here way into Africa. Let's blow this up a little bit. They came down here. Look. Hold on. Let me show y'all. They said they came down here. This is what they said. They said Europeans, white, pale faces, came down here to Western Africa and got black people from other black people. And then they shipped these people from Western and Southern Africa, right? West and Southern Africa to the Caribbean. That's the story that they told, right? But do it make more sense if melanated Europeans came down here and dealt deals with black Africans who are blacks from the continent of Africa or from the western coast of Africa, and they were enslaving the only people there who called themselves African, who just so happened to be totally different than the melanated Aboriginal man of Africa. He was the only pale face there. Do it make more sense that brown people from Europe and brown people from Africa, right, got together or brown people from Europe got with brown people from Africa and bought white slaves and brought them here to the Americas? This is where the population is the greatest at. Second greatest out of South Africa is America. It make more sense if brown Europeans did deals with brown Africans to sell the white ones. African mean troglodyte, cave dweller. I'm just saying we know who the last out of the caves was. Even Owaski tells us that. It's the people from up here in Europe. But we see you been down here 400-500 years. All up and down the western southern coast. So do it make more sense that the slaves, the Slavs of Western Africa would be pale-faced, being sold by brown people to other brown people? Or you think they just came down here and white folks just came into Africa, let me buy up some niggas? That ain't happened. Couldn't have happened. We'd have just killed you on GP just because you think you slick. No. Some brown people from up here, right? Many of them who have been running since 1486. Yeah, they talk about 1492 kicking out the Moors, but who they kick out before the Moors? Yeah, they kicked out the Moors in 1492. Who they kick out in 1486? Yeah, I know. It starts to make a little more sense. Then you come over here in America, you got eyewitnesses telling you they was enslaved in the Caribbean and in the South. Africans who are now white, who come from a long line of white folks, because the only way you white now is because you come from white ancestors. That's it. Only reason you brown now is because you come from brown ancestors. That's it. No secret. But this is the secret they hiding. Let's tie it up with some Odo. Because if you're going to be bringing this out, Cosmon, if you're going to be bringing this light out, you better know what you're talking about. You better bring some. Let's see what Owaspy got to say about this, about bringing forth this type of new light. And if anybody's saying it's new, they better be able to prove it. For which reasons? This is the Book of Judgment. Discipline, my bad. Book of Discipline, 8 and 5. For which reasons you shall explain that only facts, well known or comparatively proven, are light. An opinion is not light. That whoever professes light must know the matter by his own knowledge. That facts, numbers, figures, or axioms can demonstrate light. That facts, numbers, figures, or axioms can demonstrate light, and that without these, without the study, without the scholarship, without the sources, then the supposed light is only darkness. But remember, you can regurgitate darkness too. But if you pursue this philosophy, and you shall easily discover who among you has the highest light for real. And also, what kind of judgment shall govern the chief's rulings, right? What type of thoughts are going to issue even out of you? Hold on. Let's get back to it. Because I got $100 reward for this nigga, Edmund Kenny. Let me describe him to you. So if you see him, bring my nigga back here. He has straight hair and a complexion so nearly white that it is believed a stranger would suppose that there was no African blood in him until you learn that the African is white. He was with my boy Dick a short time since in Norfolk. This is from Virginia. And offered him for sale and was apprehended, but escaped under pretense of being a white man. Look at that. This Negro escaped under the pretense of being a white man. So you know now a Negro ain't got nothing to do with white skin. Neither does black. Neither does slave. So stop tying yourself to a narrative that ain't really yours. Because the man just told you whose narrative this is. Let's go.
But as the financial oligarchy in the South continued to depend on black enslavement, this really troubled the white yeomanry of the United States. So it was a tragedy for both, but I think especially a tragedy for white people. And of course, the most far-sighted of American statesmen founded in 1830 the American Colonization Society for the deportation of blacks back to Africa. And many black people supported this. And in fact, as you know, Pastor Peters, many blacks continue to support that to this day.
No, they don't. And the blacks who are tethers, who come from Africa, can take their ass back. But at this same ACL founding, right, it was at an AME church. The people like what's his name? Oh man, he is slipping my mind right this second. And he's supposed to be this African who came here from Africa. His daddy and them was enslaved, and he got so-called indigenous American heritage. Also, what is this dude's name? He had a boat and all that, and he was supposedly caping for this man Fredericks. But when they brought it to the black folks in the church, they was like, man, we ain't going nowhere. They said, raise your hand if you ready to go back to Africa. Not one of them raised their hand. Not one. That's because many of them already knew who they was. They didn't come from Africa. What are you talking about? Like Osceola told him, he said, I am not a slave. I am not black. Right? Don't get it twisted.
Yes. In fact, I had a black speaker at one of my past Christian family Bible camps, Mr. Brock. I don't know if you've heard of him or not.
Yes, I have.
And he's certainly an
because many of these dudes that's speaking for our people are tethers. You dig what I'm talking about? Or mixed up Pan-African pushers themselves. Now, not understanding, first of all, that the Creator ain't pigeonholed to no one little place on the earth. You think he made man in just little dry Africa with no water? You got 67 rivers over there. 67. 67,000 square miles. We got over 250,000 in America. 250, you got 250,000 freshwater sources and rivers in the Americas. Which is more likely, I'm just saying, that life boomed on. Just asking. But you're still trying to pigeonhole the Creator. You dig what I'm talking about? Like he just in one little spot and he can only do one thing, one place, and that's it. Nah. Everywhere there could have been a man, Creator produced it. The very first. Everywhere. All at once. Not in just one pair. Millions and millions and millions of pairs.
advocate of it.
Right.
So what you're saying then, Michael, is that virtually every component of what we've come to know as black slavery was first experienced by whites when they were enslaved here in America.
Absolutely. That's absolutely correct. From the fugitive slave law, where whites had a price on their head and were hunted and nearly whipped to death, and in some cases the whippings were actually fatal, to the auctioning of white slaves. As soon as they came off ships, they were taken like cattle, and their arms were felt and their teeth were examined and so forth. And it has been tremendously pressed, and people can say, what happened? Why haven't I heard about it? Well, for those of us who are a little bit sophisticated about history, we know that history is rigged and that many historians owe their jobs to how well they play with the party line. But there's also another aspect at work here, and that is the fact that in the late 18th century and throughout the 19th century and even in the early 20th century, because this bondage extends right up into the 20th century, white people were ashamed if they had a background of servitude. Many of those whites ended up settling in Appalachia. They became very alienated from the mainstream of the United States, and they were ashamed of their background. There was no one to come along and champion their cause here. They saw it as a kind of a stigma. Secondly, the aristocracy that had perpetrated this Holocaust against their own kin realized that they committed a great crime, both in the eyes of sacred scripture and in the eyes of common law. And so it was in their interest to cover this up as much as possible. So it's mostly fallen to me to be the one to dig this back up again and bring it to the attention of all people, black and white, so that we can deal with it and so that other researchers and historians can further explore it, because it's a pioneering field and there's a lot of room here for further discussion and investigation.
Where did you start going to find this material? Of course, you've got an excellent bibliography in the back, so I shouldn't ask you that, but why don't you tell the people?
Well, I live here in upstate New York, and believe it or not, New York is not entirely comprised of Manhattan. In fact, we have tried to break off the state. We've tried to make Manhattan the 51st state and make upstate New York, which is largely rural and farms, its own republic. So I'm in a very rural area, and the history here is very rich. Revolutionary War battles were fought, especially the Indian Wars of the American Revolution, with Generals Clinton and Sullivan fighting the Iroquois. And also, I'm quite near to New England. In fact, when I originally became interested in this story, it was by researching Matthew Lyon, who is one of the American Revolutionary War heroes. He was a hero of the Battle of Bennington, Vermont. The famous commander of that, of course, was Ethan Allen. But as I began to dig into Matthew Lyon's story, I discovered that Matthew Lyon was a white slave. He became a very great American politician and a congressman, and in fact, he was imprisoned in a famous sedition case after the Americans won their freedom. He was imprisoned by the Federalists, but he became a great and accomplished man. He wrote a book, and he referred to himself as "by the bulls that redeemed me." Apparently, Matthew Lyon had been sold in return for a couple of deer, a couple of male deer. And I mean, that was the status of white people in the 18th century in America. And so I couldn't find his grave, and later on I found out that he wasn't buried in New England at all, but he went down much later in his career after his wife died to the Kentucky-Tennessee area, where he made a name for himself in business. I did locate the grave of his wife, but as I discovered this, I was quite shocked that here was a great Revolutionary War hero whose life as a young man, he was an immigrant from Ireland, was worth no more than two male stags.
And But this is the story they're telling you about you. Right now, this is from Ironbark Resources, talking about white slavery in white countries. Now we drop down a little bit. They're talking about Britain and all up in here, and the slavery starting over there. But let's get down to what was going on in the Americas, right? And it say right here, let's start right here. David M. Kennedy, Elizabeth Cohen, and Thomas A. Bailey in the American pageant have noted the high numbers of quote unquote, and look, indentured servants in Virginia, and Maryland, right? We know it was most likely and predominantly Indian in Virginia. So we're going to find out that 3/4 of all slaves was white. And 3/4 of all white people in the America, period, at the time. 3/4 were slaves and indentured servants or under indentured contracts, and many of them never got their contracts paid through what you seeing right there, what he was talking about, the quote unquote black laws, right? Because of the massive amounts of tobacco crops planted by families, indentured servants, I thought these was the slaves who was growing tobacco. Now we got indentured servants, so we can already assume that these white folks, because they always trying to hide white slavery under this term, right? Because the massive amounts of tobacco crops planted by families, indentured servants, were brought in from England, wow, to work on the farms. In exchange for working, they received transatlantic passage and eventual freedom dues, including a few barrels of corn, a suit of clothes, and possibly a small piece of land. These end up becoming the head rights, right? Let's go a little further. Virginia and Maryland employed the head right system. Didn't it say you must know it? Virginia and Maryland employed the head right system to encourage the importation of servant workers. Under its terms, whoever paid the passage of labor received the right to acquire the 50 acres of land. So, that's the double. Okay, think about it. I'm going to do a deal with the government, right? But the person who actually pays, you're paying off the debt, but the person who actually pays for your transit gets the land. So in many times it was the government reneging on their own deals that they cut with these people to send them over there. Because in the end of the day, even though you worked off the debt, the initial land goes to the person who pays, right, for the passage. Look, Virginia and Maryland employed the head right system to encourage the importation of servant workers. Under its terms, whoever paid the passage of a laborer, the state, the crown, received the right to acquire 50 acres of land. So this is how they end up acquiring a state as massive as Virginia. They're sending people over there to civilize the land and then usurping it, really, in actuality, usurping it and naming the name after themselves, but letting them work the land like they think they own it. And then just come and take it when it's time. Cold. Because you never owned it. They just worked the land, civilized it, so they say, kick the natives off, do whatever you got to do. But when it's time to get down, and we coming over there en masse, we already set up. And you don't even own this land. The crown does, because the crown paid the passage. You worked off the debt. They received the 50 acres of land. In fact, you were just able to live on it. Hence, taxes in America. This is code. Look at this. That's crazy. That's actually criminally genius. Chesapeake planters brought some 100,000 indentured servants, so white folks, into the region by 1700. These white slaves represented more than what? 3/4 of all European immigrants to Virginia and Maryland in the 17th century or the 1600s. Wow. Paul Hynek, in his book, Free African Americans of North Carolina and Virginia, Dodge the Hijack. They trying to say you African. No, we just talk about Aboriginal or copper-colored Americans of North Carolina. See, you can't be an African and an American. Can't do that. Can't have two nationalities. Why are they calling you African? Because he brown. And the reason it blows the people mind, because when you instantly think African, you think brown skin. But the only Africans in the entire world are pale faces. So when you look for the descendants of pale faces, right, we find in America, they're the slaves. The African. They just taught it to us in reverse. Dang. So, but Dodge the Hijack, they taught African Americans, this is that misnomer. We know these are Indians. These are Aboriginals. You can sub the word African here for Aboriginal. Dodge the hijack. Because they remember where they from. They from North Carolina. Right? As to the story, most of the free African Americans of Virginia, how? How is there free, so quote unquote, African Americans in Virginia and there's enslaved white folk? Who was enslaved? Most of the free, quote unquote, African Americans of Virginia and North Carolina originated in Virginia. Uh-oh. Where they became free? No. Where we were always free. In the 17th and 18th century. How? That's the 1600s. We supposed to have been in slavery last 400-500 years, right? How you come from Virginia and you free? Because you Indian, you aboriginal to the land. You never came from Africa. So that's why you weren't slaved in the 16th, 17th, 18th century. Huh? They became free. No, they were always free in the 1600s, the 1700s, before chattel slavery and racism fully developed in the United States, because they aboriginals, they not Africans. This is why it stands out so much. Now that you're looking at the game with new information and a new set of eyes, with a clear spirit. When they arrived in Virginia, who? The Africans joined a society which was divided between master and white servant. Hold on. When Africans got here, right, there was master and white servants. Do that mean that the brown people was the master? They joined the same households with white servants, the Africans. Why? Because we understand that the Africans look like the white servants. This is why they joined right into the same household. With who? In who household? This is what they don't want to tell you. Many melanated Europeans and white Europeans owned white slaves. Many Aboriginal Americans owned white slaves. Also, many Aboriginals owned brown skin and white Africans. So the whole black enslaving blacks narrative, that's bullshit. At best, that's melanated Europeans enslaving Aboriginal Americans. Or vice versa. Aboriginal Americans enslaving melanated Europeans. This is where you get that European genetic from. Not because grandma was raped by no white man. Many of us from there. You just was brown. Look in your ancestry. Make sure that that person white. And remember, white ain't got nothing to do with skin color. So you're going to have to look at their culture, their heritage. You're going to have to look, see if you find some pictures. See what their kids look like. Because we just seen this Negro that looked like a white boy. We've seen white boys, and that's slaves. And 3/4 of all immigrants to America, and that's all of them, of pale face status, was enslaved at one time. They didn't tell you that, did they? Let me see if I can let me see if I can find this other one real quick, man. Hold on. Let me pull this up for y'all. All right. Because see, if Cosmon tell it to you, they won't believe it. Cosmon said they won't believe it. Right? Let's hold on. Let's read this one more real quick. Most of the free African Americans of North and Virginia and North Carolina originated in Virginia, where they became free in the 17th, 18th century before chattel slavery and racism fully developed in the United States. That's an opinion. But when they arrived in Virginia, Africans joined a society which was divided between master and white servant. They were joined by the same households. They joined the same households with white servants working, eating, sleeping, getting drunk, and running away together. The replacement of white servants with African slaves begun in earnest in the 1660s, but now we are learning the replacement of white servants with African slaves, right, doesn't change the skin color of the people. You see that? The replacement of white servants with African slaves. Let me show you an African. Hold on. Let me show you the Africans. Hold on. No, they got the here they go. Here they go. The Boers. Let me show you the Africans. Here they go. So keep this in mind. Right? Keep this in mind when they tell you stuff like when they tell you, right? The replacement of white servants with African slaves began in earnest in the 1660s, right? Remember, these people start migrating in earnest in when? 1652. Right? Ain't that what we see? Hold on. Let me show you. Ain't that what we read? First arriving at the Cape of Good Hope, what? In 1652. Until 1994, they dominated South Africa's politics. So in 1652, so when we see, right? So when we see the replacement of white servants with African slaves begun in earnest in the 1660s, continue for more than a century. African slaves had still not completely replaced white servants. By October 17, 1773, when the jailer in Prince William County advertised in the Virginia Gazette that he had caught a runaway white servant man committed to Prince William Gaol, a certain William Rawlings, who says he is the property of Francis Smith of Chesterfield. The owner is desired to pay charges and take him away. Look at this. They advertised in the same edition that he had jailed a runaway white servant woman committed to the gaol or jail of Prince William, a Servant woman, about 26 years of age, named Mary Richardson, has on a short printed cotton gown and striped Virginia cloth petticoat. A runaway servant of Robert Symington's of Conestoga, Lancaster County, though he goes by the name of William Davis. Therefore, said Smittenton is desired to come or send to know whether he is his servant or not, and if he is, to pay charges and take him away. He talks a little French, but is an Irishman. Any other person that has had a servant run away from him lately is also desired to come and see the above person, in case he should not prove to be Robert Symington. Regarding a captured white runaway slave. Well, we ain't gonna kick a dead horse. You dig what I'm talking about? The genocide, remember, the pen is stronger than the sword. The genocide first came on paper. Right? The genocide first came in on paper. Wasn't no way they could have fought you. They ushered in the taxing system to put you in peonage to the land. It was a trick. Man, if y'all got a little something up out of this, man, hit your boy with a vortex, man. We gonna go and get up out of here, man. Gotta go get the shorties from school. Keep on moving. You dig what I'm talking about? And with that being said, man, breathe in, let the light in. Cosma, and I'm out.
And oh yeah, put that Super 7 in the air. Tell me how you feeling when you're feeling up there. When you in the sky breathing rarefied air. When you're breathing rarefied air, oh yeah. Put that Super 7 in the air. Tell me how you feeling when you feel it up there. When you in the sky breathing rarefied air. When you're breathing rarefied air, just that Jehovih, that chow mein, that papabul, that tau mein, since sunset in the arc of Wayne, my brain moving like Tao Sang, so as above, it's so below, that up and that down thing, this flow is atmospherian, I call that a ground game, see water is knowledge, so if I'm teaching, you're learning, so how your God make a sun without vortexian current, see the pattern is ponic, I'm reaching out for my people, oh watch me flow through your speakers, you feel the force of the ether, and when the force gets the equal, I'm taking off like an eagle. Police popped the pastor yesterday for pushing Puerto. My DNA is Moshe. Mix that thing with higher water. My spirit rate is OTN. It's just a higher order. Got more light than Kavita. Rap a lot just like Tila. Went from sinner to saint. Shout out my big homie Sela. Got more torque than a sports car. Got more work than a door stop. And the 4 million I make, I'm giving the Dr. Umar. Oh yeah. Put that Super 7 in the air. Tell me how you feeling when you're feeling up there. When you in the sky breathing rarefied air. When you're breathing rarefied air, oh yeah. Put that Super 7 in the air. Tell me how you feeling when you feel it up there. When you in the sky breathing rarefied air. When you're breathing rarefied air, oh yeah. Super 7 in my rites and ceremonies. I'm married to Jehovah, holy matrimony. Confucius say, in the words of Caillou, before you hit the tomb, be a bridegroom. Only got one question for Miss Susan B. On how to last Ahu when it's now a ennui. Blame my inspiration, I'm just thinking thoughts. But in the way of God's, we gon' keep it short. Why Jesus wanna kill me? Matthew 10:34. Just a couple questions that I'm needing to know. Oh, watch me flow, it's so potent. Set the vortex in motion. Super 7, I'm floating across the Aegean Ocean. Oh, you a Muslim now, so I guess you making salat. Well, I'm a Israelite, I'ma make him at the Shabbat. Got Moses on the bumper, super slap off in my spaceship photosphere. So I stay lit, peace and light to the faith is so Put that super 7 in the air. Tell me how you feeling when you're feeling up there. When you in the sky breathing rarefied air. When you're breathing rarefied air, oh yeah. Put that super 7 in the air. Tell me how you feeling when you feel it up there. When you in the sky breathing rarefied air. When you're breathing rarefied air, oh yeah.